Good afternoon. Welcome to the Mississippi version of our state webinar series exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, and then you can type in your questions or any comments there. We will have a couple of periods in the webinar for questions and answers. We are recording the webinar and will send the link to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. So let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin, American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Billy Van Pelt. Billy is AFT's Senior Director of External Relations and is based in Kentucky. Billy is focused on the expansion of AFT's national initiatives across the Southeast. And for those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a very quick introduction. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress. We are an agricultural land trust, but also focus on promoting sound farming practices through soil health and water quality initiatives. We also recognize that it's not farmland without farmers. So we also focus on tools and strategies that facilitate land access for next generation producers and assist with farm transfer and succession for retiring farmers and farmland owners. Our programming and research informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. So let me now turn it over to Billy.
Thanks, Chris. We are delighted to be joined today by a number of valued partners, including the Partnership for Gulf Coast Land Conservation, Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, Milestone Cooperative Association, the U.S. EPA, several farm businesses, and USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thank you all for joining us today. We'd like to recognize and thank NRCS for their collaboration and support of this project. They've been an integral partner, as has our research partner in this project, Conservation Science Partner.
Great, thank you, Billy. So now we're going to talk about the findings from this report. Today we're focusing on the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state, and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land, and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us for our launch event in May, let me touch very quickly on our national findings. We studied the period from 2001 to 2016, which was a period of historically low housing starts. Despite that, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equivalent to all the land planted in the U.S. to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. Importantly, more than 1/3 of the land converted, about 4.4 million acres, was what we have identified as nationally significant land best suited for intensive food and crop production. And as you can see from this next map, agricultural land conversion is a growing problem across the US and especially throughout the South. Cities are sprawling, and the proliferation of farmettes and ranchettes on their outskirts has created hotspots of conversion in virtually every state, including Mississippi. So now we're going to dive into the data available for Mississippi on our interactive website. And Billy and I are going to be assisted in our website navigation by our colleague, Beth Fraser. So thank you, Beth. We're going to start here with this tab on the right, the reports and data. Here you will find the full report, the glossary, the scorecard, and a bunch of fact sheets about the methodology that was used for the report. If you are interested in accessing any of the geospatial data layers that we used, we will be making those available. If you go to this geospatial data layers where Beth has the cursor, you will see that it's a form that you can fill out, and we will be back in touch with information about what is available and when it will be available. So know that that is an option if you're interested. And with that, now we're going to go to select a state, and then we're going to drop down and get to Mississippi. And here we will then be able to look at the state-specific spatial data and the policy scorecard data. So before we get to it, we're going to go to this download Mississippi conversion summary right here on the left-hand side. If you click on that, you get to an easily downloadable 2-page PDF, which we hope that folks will find useful because it has some great infographics. It has some great key information. It's something that you can use with your members, you can use with policymakers, you can use with reporters, and for a number of different uses you can put on your websites. We hope that this will be helpful. There is also a policy summary that is also downloadable. We're not going to really talk about that, but know that that's available as well. So now let's go to the categories of spatial data. We're going to start with land cover and use. Our report uses multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including this burnt orange, well, actually the kind of orangey color, tan orange, that is the low density residential development. The dark red is urban. It also includes a first ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a farm. Our mapping shows 11.1 million acres of agricultural land in Mississippi, including 5.1 million acres of cropland, 3.3 million acres of pasture land, and 2.66 million acres of woodland associated with farms. Now we're going to look at PVR values. And for farms under threat, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the US. This map shows the range of these PVR values across the state. The higher the PVR value, the darker the green, and the lighter the green, the lower the PVR value. The higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability of that land for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. We then use these PVR values to establish and identify nationally significant land, which is the next data layer we'll look at. This next map shows just the nationally significant agricultural land in Mississippi. You'll see that 6.16 million acres falls into this category, so about 55% of the state's agricultural land base. Most of it, about 4.1 million acres, is cropland, with 1.3 million acres in pasture and 791,000 acres in woodland. And the reason why we are so especially concerned about the conversion of this nationally significant land is for both economic and environmental reasons. When land with high PVR values is impacted by development, that intensive food production is pushed to more marginal lands. For farmers, that means input costs are typically higher and/or crop yields are typically lower. It can also lead to more soil erosion and more demand for water for irrigation. So now we're going to look at conversion. And again, we looked at this 15-year period between 2001 and 2016, which had not only low housing starts, but a deep recession in the midst. We mapped the conversion of agricultural land to two types of land use. The first is urban and highly developed land use. This includes what we see as the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, so expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, largely found in cities and towns. This category, though, also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, so picks up some oil and well pads and solar installations. The second type is low-density residential development, or LDR. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. The vast majority of conversion in Mississippi over this time frame, 83% of it, was to LDR. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that there is no active agriculture on land designated as LDR. There may well be, and some of that small parcel production may be productive and profitable. But we know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in Mississippi that was considered LDR in 2001 was 8 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. And we know that continued conversion to LDR increases management challenges for producers who end up farming in and around non-farm neighbors. Total agricultural land converted over this 15-year period was almost 336,000 acres. Pasture land accounted for the most, with 163,000 acres of that, followed by woodland with 93,500 acres, followed by cropland with 79,000 acres. And in looking at the quality of the land converted, about 45% of that conversion was to land that was considered nationally significant. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Billy for some additional perspectives about the spatial findings.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's important to note here that the low density residential development is clearly the main concern here in Mississippi. If we look at this map, everything is gray is urban, but everything that's in red is what's been converted over the 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. And the bulk of that has been city residential development. So your 5-acre lots, your 10-acre lots, 15-acre lots, 20-acre lots, McMansions, the houses, the large houses that are simply built on lots that are not for agricultural purposes. So if we go north map and we start to look around the northern part of the state, you see that there's a significant amount of PVR land in the west part of the state. And you start to see the sprawl around Tupelo and Lafayette, where you have the low density residential mixed in with the PVR land. So what we're seeing there is a clear illustration of fragmentation of agriculture. And when you have fragmentation of agriculture and you have suburban uses that are intermixed with agricultural uses, then it becomes less conducive to farming and agricultural purposes. If we could scroll south on the map, please. So I think it's critically important to note all of the PVR land, productive, versatile, and resilient land, and the nationally significant land that Chris talked about earlier. Jackson, take a look at Jackson. Significant sprawl around Jackson. And it seems to be moving northward. So that's a real example there. And you have those pockets of sprawl inside of PVR land. And then if we continue to go south, we see that that the trend continues as we go south, especially around Hattiesburg. Hattiesburg is another example of where there's been significant low density residential development. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but I think it frames the conversation when you have non-agricultural uses in the form of large suburban lots intermixed with your farming. Those tend to start merging together, and this is not unique to Mississippi. We're seeing it across the nation. So first, these outlying areas start to merge together, and then the smaller cities that are sprawling start sprawling toward each other. So Chris, I'll turn it back over to you and add some commentary later in the webinar.
Great, thank you, Billy. Before we turn to the policy scorecard, we want to stop and get some input from all of you. We are interested in your perspectives on what will drive agricultural land conversion in Mississippi over the next 10 to 20 years. And we ask it now because as we start to look at policy, it's useful to think about it in the lens of what we think is going to be the cause of conversion in the future, because that policy response needs to reflect what those drivers of conversion are. So take a minute, if you would, and let us know what your thoughts about which of these are going to drive conversion from your perspective over the next 10 to 20 years in the state. You can vote for more than one, and if you're having any difficulty voting, it might be because you were in full screen mode, in which case you need to get out of it to vote. So we'll take a minute to wait for folks to answer. Okay. What are we seeing here, Beth? So it is interesting to see that people think that this continuation of what has been one of the traditional drivers of conversion will continue. That's very consistent it's consistent with what we have heard from folks in other states. And it's interesting that the energy development is seen as another potential driver of conversion as well. So with that, let's then turn to policy and look at some of the scorecard findings. Our intention with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address these traditional drivers of land conversion. So those, again, are poorly planned development, but also weak agricultural viability. We know that profitable farms tend to stay in farms. And so how that viability of agriculture goes impacts the agricultural land base. And we also know that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between generations. So those are the things that sort of framed how we were looking at the scorecard. We know that there are many ways that states support agriculture, and this is not an attempt to score them all. We know that there are marketing programs, that there are grants and loans supporting the business of agriculture, that there's export initiatives, that there's support for cooperative extension. So we focused instead on 6 specific types of policies and programs that tie directly to the land and that address one or more of those conversion drivers. So here are the ones that we looked at. First, the purchase of agricultural conservation easement, or sometimes known as purchase of development rights programs, so PACE programs or PDR programs. These voluntary programs permanently protect farmland and ranchland from non-farm development. They compensate landowners who choose to place a permanent agricultural conservation easement on their property. We see these programs not just as a way to ensure land for future generations, but as important economic development and generational transfer tools. The sale of an easement can transform part of an illiquid asset or land into cash. This frees up equity to improve or expand a farm business, to fund retirement, or to facilitate the transfer of a farm to the next generation without having to sell the land for development. And protected land is typically more affordable for a young or new farmer. We looked at land use planning and growth management. Most states, including Mississippi, delegate planning authority to local governments, and planning and zoning decisions are driven largely at the county and municipal level. Billy's going to talk about it, that local governments must be equipped with a suite of effective tools to support compact development and retain agricultural land. States, though, can play an active and important role in guiding local planning and supporting local governments with the right tools and incentives to stabilize the agricultural land base. And I would say this is true not just for the sort of traditional residential, commercial, industrial development, but increasingly around energy development as well. And so this component measures those state actions. We looked at property tax relief programs that reduce those property taxes paid on agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less municipal services than the taxes typically levied on them. These programs are often called current use or use value assessment. We looked at the 18 states that have agricultural district programs. These encourage landowners to form special use areas to support agriculture. They provide a variety of protection and incentives depending on the state. Some states limit annexation in districts, while others limit use of eminent domain and offer protection from the siting of public facilities and infrastructure. Others offer tax incentives, and some require district enrollment to participate in state PACE or PDR programs. The last 2 ones that we looked at really were getting at the land access and that generational transfer piece. So these 2 were Farm Link programs and state leasing. Farm Link programs connect farm seekers with farmers and landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture. Administered by public or private entities, they offer a range of services and resources, from online real estate postings to technical assistance, trainings, and educational resources. We looked only at those state-supported programs here. And lastly, state leasing programs are those that make state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers for agriculture. Sometimes that's their primary purpose, but more often agricultural use is secondary to generating income for a public purpose or protecting wildlife habitat. So now you see how Mississippi scores relative to other states, if we can scroll down to the scores. And what I want to point out here is that some states, especially on the east and west coasts, have faced rapid loss of farmland for decades. And the high scores here reflect the actions that those states on the coast have had to take to stem the rapid conversion of their farm and ranch land for decades. And our point here is that we don't expect Mississippi to have had that same kind of high response necessarily on any of these policies, but that as Mississippi begins to feel this development pressure more intently, it will similarly need to increase its policy responses here if it hopes to retain its land base for a profitable agricultural industry. The website allows you to dive into the factors behind the scores, so we're just going to do that for a little bit here. You go to the select policy or programs, and we're going to start with land use planning. Again, our intent with this piece of the scorecard is to look at how state government is guiding or enabling local land use planning in a way that supports the agricultural land base. So Mississippi here gets points for authorizing local planning commissions and authorizing municipalities to make comprehensive plans. You can see if you go up that the higher scoring states in this category have state goals around retaining their farmland and or promoting compact development. They then incentivize or require consistency between those state goals and local plans. Other states provide support or incentives to local governments to develop farmland protection plans and strategies specifically. So now let's take a quick look at property tax relief. And Mississippi here gets points for having agricultural use value assessment. What I just want to point out is that some states that score high in this category require verification that land in that use value assessment is in active agricultural use. And some states impose withdrawal penalties under certain conditions for lands taken out of use value. In fact, some states use those withdrawal penalties to fund their state or local farmland protection programs. Some states also provide additional property tax relief in exchange for short-term non-development covenants. And then lastly, we're going to look at state leasing. And we did this again because we feel that making state-owned land available for lease provides opportunity, especially for young and new producers. And this is especially important in a state like Mississippi, where there are 6 times as many producers over the age of 65 as under the age of 35. And what we see here is that Mississippi seems to have active leasing of agricultural land with a transparent process and lease terms that are supportive of agriculture. So all of those are very positive. And let's take a minute for just looking at a couple of the programs and policies that Mississippi doesn't have. While Mississippi does not have a state PACE program, there is federal funding available for the purchase of permanent agricultural conservation easements. This is through both the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program and the Agricultural Land Easements subpart of that program, as well as through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Both of these programs are administered by USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Mississippi has used some ASEP funding for farmland protection, and we hope that the $2 billion provided in the 2018 Farm Bill, as well as some key statutory changes, will increase its use in Mississippi. A couple of these changes, the elimination of the cash match requirement and the ability to do things called buy, protect, sell projects, we hope will be especially valuable. And the National Agricultural Land Network, again, we'll talk about a little bit later, will be providing some additional programming around buy, protect, sell later this year. I also want to stress the value of statewide programming that helps older farmers and farmland owners with farm transfer and succession, especially finding a younger operator if they have no heirs interested in taking over the family farm. That is why a number of states are investing in resources like online farm linking services or expanding programming through cooperative extension or in partnership with NGOs. So I hope that was a helpful cruise through the findings. If you have questions, please write them in now. And as we go out of the website, we're going to launch a second poll, which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for Mississippi. And again, you can vote for more than one. My apologies that we weren't able to fit in the state leasing and farm link. If you feel that one or both of those are the most important, please write them in the question panel. And again, we'll take a minute to let people vote. Okay. How are we doing here? All right. Well, this is very consistent with what we see from folks in other states about policies that people feel are important to focus on. So that land use planning and thinking about ways to encourage more permanent farmland protection, whether that's at the state level or county level, local level, through purchase of ag conservation easements. And interesting that there is some interest in agricultural districts, which I do think is worth a look at for a state like Mississippi as a way to sort of bundle protections for farmers and farmland. So now we're going to just talk about one thing that is missing from the spatial analysis, which is protected agricultural land. Because there was not a comprehensive data layer that was focused specifically on farmland and ranchland. We are now building this new database. If you have not heard from us and hold agricultural conservation easements, please let us know by adding a comment in the question panel. I do see some little bits of green. So we certainly have some data, but there may be data that we're missing, and we would like to be sure we get everyone. So let's pause now and see, Billy, if there are any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Let's take a look here. I don't see any questions, but you're spot on. What we're seeing here consistently across the United States as we meet with people on these webinars, consistently we're talking about improvements in land use planning, more concerted efforts at farmland protection and conservation easement programs, and just really elevating the whole conversation around planning for the future of agriculture. So I think I don't see any questions, but I'm just going to make that observation with the poll results is that this is something that AFT can address holistically as we continue to work across the U.S. I do have a question. The question is, have you included the forest legacy easements in the easement database as working forest easements?
Well, that's a good question. I do not know the answer. So I think that probably we should ask and be back in touch with the person who posed the question. My guess, if I was going to guess, is no, because I think we are focused specifically on agricultural land and not all forest land easements. So that's my guess, but I will confirm that and we will be back in touch.
So, Chris, just to confirm, I know that we, as part of our data, and this came up when we did the release of the national level data 2 years ago. We actually had in a state that had a great deal of forestry, and we have mapped forested lands as on our data layer. Forested lands are included in Farms Under Threat's data layer. But I think that this is a great question. What about those easements? And so, as Chris said to the questioner, we will get with our Director of Farms Under Threat, and respond to you. I know the person that asked this question, and I will make sure you get that information.
Great, and let me just offer one last observation on that, because I think that in terms of thinking about protected agricultural land, we know that there are a lot of easements that, like through the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, for instance, that there can be a lot of woodland in those easements. So I want to be sure that we recognize that we are, in terms of that protected ag land database, that we are picking up quite a bit of woodland if it is part of an easement that includes agricultural land. I think that the reason why I said what I did with respect to Forest Legacy is because my understanding of that program is that those are typically entirely forested or virtually entirely forested. So that's why I think we didn't. But again, we will be back in touch with that answer for sure.
Okay, well, moving on here, I think it's apparent from our discussion today that time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, which is why AFT just announced a goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. We know that to get to this goal, we need to lock arms with as many partners and practitioners on this call and others around the United States who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. I want to talk about the ways that American Farmland Trust will be strengthening its commitment to saving the land that sustains us across the country and in the South in particular. First, we want to establish the National Agricultural Land Network, providing new leadership in key locations. American Farmland Trust is using our data and our findings to inform where 2 offices will be located in the Southeast over the next year. Protecting more farmland ourselves and with partners. Farmland Trust is a land trust, and we started the ag conservation movement in the early 1980s, but we created numerous private land trusts and numerous PACE and PDR programs. So we don't want to compete with where there's existing farmland protection programs and land trusts. And so we support our land trust and farmland protection partners, but if there's not a viable land trust or PACE or PDR program in place, we will hold easements. And so that's what we mean when we say protecting more farmland with ourselves and our partners. We want to lift up our partners, help them more land, and we will also conserve land as well. Advocating for stronger state and federal policies. We want you to use this data to change policies across your state and at the federal level. I personally am going to be visiting with legislators across the South and Southeast to help introduce these findings to key decision makers. I'd be happy to partner with anyone on this call. And in addition to that, promoting research-based decision making. So that's what this data is all about. If you go to our microsite, we want you to use this data to elevate the whole discussion in your state on why there is such a great need to protect more farmland. And across this is not specific to Mississippi. This is a national issue. So if we could move on to our next slide at this time. So what more can Mississippi do? Analyzing and mapping agricultural land trends and conditions. So we want to continue to use this so that planning entities can map these trends like the proliferation of large lot development and low density residential that's happening in Mississippi and in states across the nation, strengthening or adopting a coordinated suite of policies. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here and just say that typically in the best case scenario of protecting farmland, local communities will have comprehensive planning processes. They will have professional planning staff, planning commission. They will have a goal for farmland protection in each county. They will have urban growth boundaries so that you have compact contiguous development and you don't have sprawl, and that in your rural areas you have large lot minimum. We're talking viable agricultural lot sizes, 30 acres, 40 acres and above, to stop the proliferation of low density residential development. To have ag zoning that prohibits non-agricultural uses in your rural area, and again, farmland protection, either through donated conservation easements or purchase conservation easements through a PACE or PDR program or through a private land trust. Supporting farm viability and access to the land, planning for agriculture, not just around it. So we plan a great deal for our areas, but what we're talking about today is planning for agriculture, planning to protect enough farmland so that we can feed ourselves and sustain ourselves. And then saving the best, but don't forget the rest. And so, this is a great point to bring up the fact that while we want to conserve farmland, but we want to also consider how that strategy meshes with the more marginal lands. And this perhaps informs our decision on where solar siting takes place, that we're not putting solar on our best farmland, but placing it on our more marginal lands. That's just an example. And American Farmland Trust has a whole solar siting document that you can read. And I know that Chris is at our website, which is farmland.org, but we also have farmlandinfo.org, which is where we keep all of our data and studies that we over the years. And that is another place that you can go to find our cost of community services studies. So if you go to farmlandinfo.org, type in cost of community services, you can actually read about over 80 studies that American Farmland Trust has done across the country rather, and they all essentially say the same thing. Sprawl uses more in services than it pays in taxes. It uses less in services than it pays in taxes, and your core urban areas are using even less. So even though ag and your urban areas are creating a gain on each tax dollar, sprawl is exceeding the services used per tax dollar that they pay. And so an example would be in a community that I'm familiar with where sprawl is using $1.70 in services for every dollar it pays in taxes. Ag is using 70 cents and your core urban area is using 30 cents. So that's just one illustration. So all informs how planning for the future of agriculture and smart planning should be done in an ideal situation. So Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Billy. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. So if people do have them, please feel free to write them in. But in the meantime, let me go ahead and talk about these two resources and launch our last poll, which actually, Beth, let's do right now. Because these two resources, the Farmland Information Center and the National Agricultural Land Network, are initiatives that AFT has, largely in collaboration with USDA's NRCS. And our interest is in providing additional technical assistance to folks who are working in the arena of working lands protection and what type of technical assistance would be most helpful to you as you are trying to address agricultural land conversion. So please take a minute to vote, if you would, on what type of assistance and what types of information you would find particularly useful. And if you have other ideas of things that you think would be important, please feel free to add them to the question line. Okay, Beth, let's see what we have here. Okay, so that's very helpful to know the information both about policy tools as well as around some of those local agricultural protection plans and focusing on ag conservation easements. So thank you for providing that input. The Farmland Information Center is a collaboration we've had with Natural Resources Conservation Service for decades. It is a national clearinghouse around agricultural land. It is intended for a broad audience, so from landowners to producers to academics to practitioners who are engaged in planning and farm and rangeland protection. So here you can find anything from information about the sort of basics. What is an agricultural conservation easement? How does it work? If you have producers who you are working with or landowners you're working with, it's a great way to send them to the website to find more information about basically what are the advantages? Why should I do this? What are the tax incentives that go along with easements if you donate them? There's also a farmland protection directory, so that if you are in a part of the state where it's not clear who it is that provides support and help in doing agricultural conservation easements, that farmland protection directory will help point out a land trust or a public program if there is one. For practitioners, there's a lot of information around state policy. As Billy said, there's like the cost of community services studies, there are other studies that help to make the case for why retaining agricultural land is important and why permanent farmland protection is important. So you'll find many of those studies. There's also a wealth of information and statistics for those who are interested in that kind of thing. The National Agricultural, well, let me say one last thing about the Farmland Information Center. We are increasingly putting up additional resources around the agricultural conservation easement program, particularly the ALE part of that program. So shortly there will be much more additional information that provides all of the types of forms that one needs if you are an entity that is working on submitting applications to that program. The National Agricultural Land Network is geared specifically to practitioners and professionals who are focused on agricultural land retention through planning and that permanent protection. Again, focusing on the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program and our CPP are two federal programs that we are hoping and planning to have additional conversations around with partners around the US and in particular regions in order to be able to understand what is needed to increase the use of those programs in particular parts of the country. So that's something we will be doing over the next 6 to 9 months. We are also will be doing additional programming, and this is both national and again on the regional basis, of what are those land protection tools that are the most important? What are some of these land use planning tools that Billy was talking about earlier? What are those both at the state level? What are those at the county and local level? But to also be talking about um, permanent farmland protection. And again, how do we think about expanding or creating easement programs where there aren't any? And so we will be having this fall a webinar series that is focused on policy tools. That will be followed by additional programming around some of those land use planning and, as we say, planning for agriculture tools. So I hope folks will sign up for the network. You can see it there. It's at farmland.org/NALN, or you can email me or call me at the number listed right there. So with that, Billy, let me turn it back to you to close us out.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I'd also invite you to email me at bvanpelt@farmland.org to ask me any additions. And I can also be reached on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect with you. Just note that you were on our webinar. And we look forward to part one on this call. And maybe just a closing comment about phase 3 of Farms Under Threat. So the next phase of this 3 national examination at the national, state, and now local level. Phase 3 will project out to 2040, examining housing, population increases, and climate change. So we want to look at all 3 of those and look at how they are going to impact our best farmlands in the year 2040 so that we can mitigate those impacts now. So Mississippi is a coastal state. There are several coastal states. And if you look at a map of the US, the bulk of the farmland conversion has been east of the Mississippi River, and that has been in the southeast. And there's a significant amount of conversion along the coast. So as we have sea level rise in the future, the most productive, versatile, and resilient soils in our coastal states will be under greater threat. So we have to protect those soils now. So stay tuned for phase 3 of Farms, and thank you all.
Thank you.